Okay, recording. Hello, it's Jen Lee here with David and Rakesh. We are here for the 11th Automation Hour webinar. So thanks for joining. Happy Friday to all. And sure my presentation moves forward. Cool. All right, for those who are new, joining us for the first time, Automation Hour, we try and meet every other Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. The remaining webinar for this month is with Peter Fife on February 17th. And for March, we have our second-time presenter, Doug Ayers, MVP, on March 3rd, Stewart on 317. Hi, Stuart, I see that you're on. We do have a scheduling change to note. Martin's webinar was originally scheduled for 3:31, and we're pushing that up a week to 3:24. So those who have registered for the webinar, you should have gotten a notification of that scheduling change. And we're going to look to start scheduling the April, May, and June webinars shortly, so that presenter could be you. So if you haven't submitted an idea and would like to be considered for the April, May, and June slots, please share your use case with us, and then we'll include you on the reach out for speakers. So for logistics, all lines will be muted. Please use the question function that we have to ask questions. Definitely use our success community, Salesforce Automation Hour, to post your questions as well. We will send out a link to the recording and deck after the session. We'll also post that out on Automation, our success community, on the website, as well as Twitter. Our sponsor, we want to give a shout out to Concrete.io. Without them, we really wouldn't have this webinar series, so thank you for sponsoring us. And here are your co-hosts, Rakesh, myself, and David. This is a picture that we took from Dreamforce 16. And the team will be at Southeast Dreamin' in March in Atlanta. So we're going to be reunited again. And we will be presenting. So I will be presenting a session called So You Want to Go with the Flow but Don't Know How. And David and Rakesh are tag teaming on learning to crawl, walk, and run with Process Builder. So if you are going to be out there at Southeast Streaming, please come by and say hi to us. And with that, I am going to hand this off to our guest speaker, Matthew Selfer, who will be presenting today. So let me hand that off to him.
Hey, everybody. This is Matthew calling in from foggy Oakland, California as of today. Glad to be here and presenting for everybody and excited for this. So I think some of these were already discussed here, and there's me. All right, here we are. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. Things that expire and what to do with them. And if you haven't already read my slide, it involves flow. So probably a lot of people out there have some sort of expiration requirement that they've come across at some point in their Salesforce admin journey. And if you haven't, you probably will, because expirations affect many things. We have things like subscriptions, memberships, certifications, licenses, anything that's got a best by date or anything that you would need to know about on kind of a date basis, you're probably going to need to track some sort of expiration date. And the business requirement that I've seen time and time again is we create some sort of custom expiration date field And then we want some email notifications leading up to that expiration date. So a few scheduled notifications that go to some contact or email address related to your record that are related to that date. Okay, so far so good, and many of you might have already been thinking, well, I already know how to do that, and it's called Process Builder, and I'm okay there, right? So what I'm here to tell you today is actually, I'm sorry, but there's a number of things to be concerned about with using this kind of approach with Process Builder. So I'm just gonna kind of point out the obvious with what happens with Process Builder here. You start with your object, and you have this little decision node, and that's what really triggers your record to enter the process. So a record has to first enter your process, and then if that has actually taken place after that, scheduled actions can proceed in order. So they will proceed in order, and then when they're done, they'll be done. So there are some interesting implications of this now that we know kind of what it is that Process Builder does. The first kind of more obvious one is, okay, so I just created, I'm admin A, and I just created my new expiration process in Process Builder today. Only problem is I had member X join sometime in the past, and if I am not aware that I need to get member X's record to enter my Process Builder process, well, that person will never enter the process, and therefore will never expire, and that could come as a surprise to some people. Okay, what else have we got here? I've actually got 6 items I'm going to go through here having to do with why Process Builder is maybe not your friend for this kind of a use case. The next one has to do with if you deactivate the user who caused the criteria to be met. So I've got business user B who works on the membership team. Business user B set up member X, and they were the ones who were responsible for triggering the Process Builder criteria so that member X would enter the process. Okay, but unfortunately the time comes where business user B moves on and we had to deactivate that person, and unfortunately if anybody you deactivate, all the waiting scheduled actions that they were responsible for triggering basically die on the vine, and you get error emails. You do become aware of it. They send you error emails to let you know that this happened, but the trick is figuring out what to do next, because you have to be sensitive to some of the other factors that come into play in terms of triggering records back into a process, some of which I'll get to later. All right, this is one that might make your hair stand on end a little bit. It did for me, certainly. So member X joins your organization and triggers Process Builder criteria. And later on, we decide that the Process Builder version that we created initially doesn't work for us. Maybe the timings don't work anymore, that we wanted to change the timings of notifications. Maybe we wanted to use different notifications. Maybe we want something completely different to start happening. In any case, you can deactivate that Process Builder version. You can replace it with a new version. You can have a completely inactive Process Builder process, and yet that record will still continue through the same old scheduled actions that they were scheduled for originally, and you have to actually delete a record that's hiding around in Salesforce called something like an interview, flow interview. I can't remember the name of it at the current moment, but in any case, you got to delete something to make that stop. All right, so the next one, this is the one that shows up in terms of some particularly weird user experiences. So say, for instance, I had my issue number 2 happen where I had to deactivate the business user who was responsible for triggering a record into a workflow, and so I have to make that record re-enter my process. Unfortunately, for a particular record, say it's 10 days before the date they're supposed to expire, and previous to this, they would have already gotten their 90, 60, and 30-day expiration notifications. Unfortunately, when I re-trigger that record back into the process, Process Builder doesn't look at that and say, well, we're just going to skip 90, 60, and 30 because 90, 60, and 30 are in the past. In fact, what it does is it tries to play catch up, and it tries to do everything that would have happened in the past all at once. So what you end up with is 3 emails with conflicting information, all going out to your member, all at the same time. And that's definitely one that has led to some interesting customer service experiences on our end in the past. All right. What's wrong with Process Builder Part 5? All right, so records do have to re-trigger criteria to enter a process, and that's kind of come up before, but there's another aspect of this which is worth noting, which is if the criteria that you have to trigger the member to enter the process or whatever record you're working with doesn't change, then your record won't re-enter the process. So for instance, you could very well think that a good set of criteria to have your person enter your process is when the member status is set to active. Unfortunately, if you have a member who renews membership before the status is set to active, before the status is no longer inactive, like before you set it to expired, for instance, then that record won't proceed through the same sequence again. So this goes back to what I had said earlier on the screenshot of the process builder. These scheduled actions proceed in order, and once you've done one, it's not going to redo that action until you re-trigger the record back into its process. And then finally, there is a limit on how many records you can have waiting around for a scheduled action to happen at any given time across all your objects and all your records in your organization. So, and that limit is 30,000, which, depending on the size of your overall data, that may not be an acceptable limit for all of the various expirations you may want to have going at any one time. All right. So I became aware of all of this issue, and I proceeded through the various stages of grief with kind of my previous ideas, about what Process Builder could do for us, and I created this idea, and I went on the Success community and I griped about it, and I got some votes for it, and there might still be some action at some point to address this sort of issue, but in the meantime, I got busy and tried to figure out, well, knowing this limitation and knowing that Process Builder kind of is what it is and has some kind of inherent architectural aspects of it that may not really lend itself to being an adequate solution for this kind of thing, I took matters somewhat into my own hands, and I tried an approach using flow. And basically, what we're talking about here, for those of you who are familiar with this kind of developer terminology, what I essentially developed was a cron job in flow. And with that, I am going to go demonstrate a cron job in flow. And the first thing that we're going to do is do a chatter post every minute. This is a pretty unhelpful example in terms of things that you might actually want to ever do, but it nonetheless illustrates a point pretty well. So I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit since I know I'm sharing the screen. And I'm going to go ahead and open up a flow that I created earlier in my developer instance here. So I'm going to go ahead and open this one up. Okay, so this is a very simple flow, and what it is essentially serving as is a scheduled cron job, effectively, that does something on a schedule repeatedly, basically forever and ever. And you can see it's in a little bit of a cyclical format here. It's eating its own tail, so to speak. Um, and I'm going to go ahead just and talk through what it's doing. So the first thing that it does when you start it is it posts to Chatter. And that's a pretty simple one. I'm just associating that Chatter post with my own user in my dev org, and the message is hey. And then what I do then is I have a date and time field. So I've got a variable here. This is a date time variable. It can be private to my flow. I default it to the current date and time that I run the flow. And then what I do with that as I go through this is I increment it. So the first thing that I do here is I'm going to set my date and time equal to, and here we have a formula. So the formula I've named my date time plus a minute. And you can probably guess what my date time plus a minute is, but in effect, this is what it looks like. It's my date and time plus 1 divided by 1440, which 1440 is how many minutes there are in a day. So what you're essentially doing is adding a minute to your date and time. Finally, what we have in this loopy flow is a wait element. And until I started doing this, I had never used wait elements. I kind of considered wait elements a little bit of a head scratcher. I wasn't really sure where they would ever come in handy, but I have since discovered it, and the answer is for these kinds of use cases. So basically what it's doing is waiting for the date and time value. And the date and time is continually being incremented each time it goes through the cycle. So what it's basically doing is it's waiting for that new date and time to arrive for each turn of the wheel. When it's done waiting, it'll do a chatter post. And I've actually got this flow running currently. It is running ongoing. I have an instance of it. If I close this out, I'll go to my chatter, and you can see the history of my chatter that's been happening as of recently. I've been chattering hey every minute for like the last hour, and it's a good thing nobody's following me in my dev org, because it'd be pretty obnoxious to be on the receiving end of all of this. But in any case, that's a little demonstration for you. And finally, what I will do to kind of close the loop on all of this, at some point, you're probably going to want to manage that. At some point, you might want it to stop. What you have down here, you may or may not have noticed down at the bottom of all your flows, you've got a list of your paused and waiting interviews. And here, in fact, is the waiting interview that has been running every minute for the last hour or so. And all I have to do to make it stop is delete it, which I will do now. And so, as of just now, the chatter posts should have stopped. That's what should have happened, incidentally, just now. All right, so that's the end of demo 1. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to think a little bit about, I needed this to do expirations, and I also wanted there to be some features around expirations that would support me in my role as an administrator, running this flow, knowing what's going on, troubleshooting it as needed. And so I started to think a little bit, well, what would I want that flow to do? if I had kind of my ideal flow, and I proceeded to try to build it. So some of the things that I was thinking about at the time, and you could kind of have your own list of things that would be nice features. What I decided was I wanted to be able to tell the flow what time to run every day. I wanted the flow to send me email to let me know which records were processed every time it runs. I would like for that flow to be run immediately, or I'd like to run it sometimes on a daily schedule, or maybe there could even be schedules other than daily, like every 7 days, every 30 days, that kind of a schedule. I would want that flow to potentially be run for a date other than today, and the reason that I would want that would be, say for instance something fails and the whole thing crashes over the weekend and I end up having to play catch up on some automated actions. I would want to at that point run it for maybe some day in the past so that I could play catch up and have automations processed when I get back in the office on Monday. In support of that also, and to support the testing process and make sure things aren't breaking, I also wanted a log-only mode so that I could preview what was going to happen before it actually happened. And I also wanted that flow to make sure that only one instance of itself was running at a given time. So the way that I accomplished that, you'll see in a moment. And then I did have this idea about, well, it's possible that there could be certain dates where a large number of records might be getting updates, and so I would really ideally like the flow to batch itself so that it doesn't encounter flow limits, which come into play either based on the number of SOQL queries, in this case probably most likely the number of elements that you cycle through in a given flow. So with all of those wish list items being there, I'll go ahead and show you a more involved expiration process that I worked on and am using currently. So here I've got in one of my sandboxes, I've got a membership related set of scheduled actions. So what I've got here is a more complex flow, and it does a number of those things that I was just describing. I'm going to go ahead and open it up here, and it's not wanting to show it all on one screen. I'm gonna just full screen so that we have a little more real estate to work with. All right. So what's happening here? So I have a much more involved flow in this case. I've got a lot going on in this, but effectively there's a method to it, and there are certain pieces that I could actually use again the next time I want to automate some sort of an expiration process. So we start by setting the run date and time based on, I guess, a formula that is telling us that's taking a few default or passed in date and time variables into the mix. And it's making a decision about whether it wants to run the whole thing now or wait for the next scheduled date and time that we set it for. Sometimes we want to just run it now, so it'll proceed through looking things up and making decisions about whether that record will be processed. And then finally, there's this decision about do we want to log everything, or do we want to actually process the updates that we are interested in at this point. Finally, I have it sending a run log, which is a kind of a core piece that is what delivers a lot of the good information about what is going on in my flow. Finally, we are We're doing some assignment elements to kind of clear some of the things that were specific to um, a particular path through all of this. And if there was in fact a need to loop that flow, we would have the snake bite its own tail again and run back through its and eventually hopefully get to that wait element where it's waiting to do it all over again. I'm not going to open up all the various elements of this flow. I actually have published an unmanaged package out there, which I will share out on Chatter for the Success Community group around Automation Hour. I'm going to go ahead and post out a link to an unmanaged package that has a sort of a templatized version of this if you want to dig into it and learn more about it and even configure it for your own purposes. But what I do want to demonstrate here, because this may be a little bit new to a lot of the folks on the line, is that I actually very seldom have to go in and change anything in here. And the way that I avoid changing anything is I use input variables through my URL. So what does that mean? So I think everybody probably, well, if you've messed around much with flow, you've probably seen that on any given flow, there's a URL, and that URL is if you go to that URL, it runs your flow. So if I were to simply copy this and I've got my, and I paste that on the end of my domain. So here's my domain, and I've just pasted in what comes at the end of the URL. And I run this. Okay, so it's telling me that my flow interview is waiting, which is a good thing because most of the time when I run this, I want it to wait until probably the middle of the night tomorrow. I'm having these things run on a daily basis, so the default timing that I have it set to is somewhere just after midnight in the middle of the night. So the wait element is it's waiting up, and when midnight or a little after midnight comes, it'll resume, and this will just continue to run in the background. Now that I've done this, you should be able to see that in fact there is this running flow interview that I just created, and it's going until I delete it, or until something else happens that would cause it to fail or be deleted. So, but that's not all that I can do in terms of what I just did was run that flow with all of its default variables and values. But sometimes I may want to run it a little differently, and this is where URL parameters come in. So what we have here is the same URL, but with some stuff added to the end. And anybody who's worked with URL parameters will recognize this question mark. That marks the beginning of a URL input parameter. And then what I'm doing here is I'm passing in some additional information to my flow, and I'm telling it a couple of things. The first thing that I'm telling it is, well, I have a variable in here. It's a Boolean variable that allows input from the outside, and it's called vlog_only. And when vlog_only is true, in the case of a URL, true is 1, then I want to send myself an immediate email. Instead of actually processing anything, I'm just finding out information about this run and sending it to my email. Then we have the run date. So I'm telling it here that I would actually like it to run for today. The default might be tomorrow because it might default to wanting to get started um, midnight, very early the next morning, but I actually want it to tell me about today. So I'm passing in log only and tell me about today only, and I'm going to run this. And now when I do that, it tells me my flow finished, and that also makes sense because unlike the time that I ran it last time where it was waiting for something to happen, in this case it actually bypassed the wait element and um, it actually just finished doing what it was going to do. And so the latest that so actually what that resulted in was I got an email right away. So um, what I have here is what I've set up in terms of my run email, and I'll zoom in a little bit on this so that everybody can see. Um, so this just came from my sandbox, and I've got run date and time. In this case, it is giving it to me in my local time. I've got a little bit of information now about kind of some of what happened on that run. So it decided to run it now. It's not running it on a loop, and it is running it in log-only mode. So it's good to know that that's how it did it. And it says members to update this run 0. Unfortunately, there weren't any records that met my criteria, but what I'm going to do next is set one up so that you can see what is going to happen there. So what I'll go ahead and do now is create a contact that will meet my criteria, and then it should work better. So I'm just going to go real fast here, and I'm going to set some membership information here. So I'm going to say the status is currently active, but the person expired. Well, let's see. So that person should be expiring today, and they probably became a member a year ago. So let's give them that date as a start for their last membership cycle. Oh, I needed to give it an account. So okay, I may not have any accounts at all in this sandbox. We'll go back and redo that. And here's my membership status of active, my expiration date, and I'm going to save that. Oh, here's my account. Okay. So we created my contact. Now, if I go back and run my flow one more time, and I'm just going to paste in what I have for the URL of that again. Looks the same, but what I'm going to get is a new email. And in fact, it is telling me some new information. So this time around, members to update it found one. And I can see it pulled in the name, pulled in the expiration date. Here I have it telling me what kind of automation it wants to run. And then this is a link. I had decided that in my email I wanted it to always show me a link directly to the record so that I could go there and work on it. So in order to actually make that automation take effect, where you actually expire that person, that's where you go and you use Process Builder. And this is just to show you guys that it's not about being anti-Process Builder over here. I'm still really into Process Builder for the stuff that it does well, and in fact, I will go ahead and find the Process Builder process that handles piece of all of this. So effectively what you're doing here is contact. We have a contact process. And what I'm doing in this process is I'm waiting for a special custom field that I set up called membership automation to be set to expiration, which is what the flow is going to do. So you can see that there's this, I will have created this field on my object that I'm expiring. I can make this field admin only. No other users have to see this field. I can completely disable all visibility and access to this field for anyone except system admins if I want to, which will prevent people from automating things accidentally. So what I do there is I actually automate is when that pick list option is updated, I'm gonna do the things that the automation requires. So in this case, one thing that I'm doing on expiration is I'm updating the status field, and I'm updating actually the contact as well as in the case of our use case in our organization, not only does somebody's membership expire, but we tie in all their certifications with that too. So I'm also updating child certifications at the time of expiration. And but what we're doing here is we're basically setting a membership status to expired based on an update to a pick list, which is what happens in my flow. So what I wanted to do before I open it up for questions is just talk a little bit about what other URL input parameters you could have here. So I will go ahead and open back up my flow and show just a few of the options that you could choose to set up for yourself. So I'm opening this up here. Here's my scheduler. Oh, that's the template. I want my membership scheduled actions. So looking into the Explorer, basically anything that I want as an input variable, I can set up in my variables here. So I can set, in this case, I've set up an input variable called vDaysBetween, where I can tell it I actually want it to run every week instead of every day. So if that were the case, I would pass in a 7, but it defaults to 1. It defaults to daily in this case. Another input parameter that I might give it would be run hour and run minute. So by default, I've got some values that as far as when I would like this process to be run. Because we're here in California in Pacific time, I default it to 08. And why do I default it to 08? Because that's 8 a.m. UTC, which is midnight in California time. So I want that default run hour to be at the midnight hour in California. I've also got run minute. So this actually comes in handy if you have multiple of these things running at the same time and you don't want them to be running concurrently. So I could pass in, I guess the default would be a minute past the hour, but you can pass in 02, 03, 05, 08, any minute value, and it'll interpret that. A few things to note about the about how you can kind of get around some of the tricky aspects of how to do this. So one of the kind of less documented features of flow is that you can actually use OR criteria when you're looking up records, and this looks a little bit confusing when you at first glance. You've got a lookup on a contact on the contact object where you've got multiple lookups on this field membership expiration date, and it's comparing it to multiple different values that are defined in formulas or variables or whatever it is. So you would think, based on this, that you would never find any results because it would be impossible for all of these formulas to equal the membership expiration date. But in fact, when you have multiple of these rows on a lookup for the same field, it does function as an OR. So that's a good one to know about. It avoids your having to do too many lookup elements in the same flow. Another trick that I employed here had to do with the run log that you saw. So we went back here. What you would actually see if I had multiple records that had evaluated for this, they would each show up on their own line. And what I did here was I actually added values to, let me just find where I did that. Okay, so what I do for every instance of a member that I find in my lookup is I want to add it to my list of rows that I'm displaying on my email. So what I'm doing here is I'm capturing this variable, I'm calling it member details, and I'm adding a specific member's detail, and I'm defining that in a formula. So the formula, if I pull that up, it does a few things here. So I'm giving it the name and a comma, and I'm giving it the expiration date and a comma, and I'm giving it the text of the membership automation that I want to do, and a comma, and I'm giving it, I've got a formula where I'm defining how to get the URL, or the base of the URL for the domain, and then I'm passing in the contact ID to complete the URL for that link. Finally, and this is one you may not have encountered before, I'm effectively accomplishing a line break. And the way that I do that is I've got a text template in here where I'm replacing a squiggly with nothing. And why would I do that? Well, it probably requires that you look at this text template. So here's my line break text template. It's a squiggly above a squiggly. So if you think about it, if I replace the squigglies in this, all that's left is the line break. And so that's how I get a line break passed into my variable, which then will show up on the email in terms of multiple different lines for my stuff here. So we're now at 1:15, and I've gotten pretty deep into some fairly complicated stuff. So I wanted to take this opportunity to respond to some questions. Okay. So Jen or any of you other guys, are you going to be passing questions over to me, or should I try opening up the questions and reading them aloud?
You can open them up just so you can read along, but I'll read out the first question here. So
Okay.
Rita asks, so using the flow URL with parameters is a way to provide data to test a flow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time for me? You've got to. I'll pull up the question pane too so that I can read it.
So using the flow URL with parameters is a way to provide data to test a flow.
Yeah, if you set your flow up with parameters and you have some sort of an output mechanism, that would be a good way to test a flow. So as long as you're confident in your output mechanism, so that might be a place to start though, if you're thinking about testing a flow. and you want to make sure that it's going to do the things that you expect it to do. You can basically start with figuring out your outputs for some sort of a testing mechanism, and that's really what I did here, because to be honest, it's a little bit scary putting together a flow that that eats its own tail like this. You can, if you do it wrong or in a way that actually causes it to bypass the wait element but continue to loop, you can end up with a flow that's just running, and eventually it hits a wall. But in the meantime, you may want to make sure that it isn't actually going to process every record in your database. So it can be a great idea when you start doing this to think about how you're going to test it. Make sure that the testing mechanism sort of aligns with the update mechanism, so that it will, so that you can feel confident when you launch the flow that it'll do what you expect.
All right. So next question we have is, how are you initiating the flow and guaranteeing that that URL is set correctly?
Right now, what I have been doing is initiating the flow through the URL, and I've been relying on myself getting the URL correct, and that's actually something that is a potential improvement that somebody could implement to all of this. So one solution that had occurred to me at one point that you could do would be to actually create a parent screen-based flow, and you would have this as a subflow of that flow. So effectively, you could create a screen-based flow for yourself where you set up the various input parameters and mapped them to inputs in your looping flow that can be automatically triggered. And then I guess what that effectively does is it gives you the ability to kind of create an interface for yourself or for whatever other admins you might have in your org, and ensures that anything that they're trying to pass in as a parameter will actually be spelled correctly as a parameter and that kind of thing. Anything else here? Let's see.
Yeah, we do. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get this question right, Bruce. I see it kind of came in 3 different pieces, but I'll give it my best shot. So feel free to ask it again. Can you describe a refactoring challenge? You went in to revise or enhance a flow like this. Always do this, never do that, etc.
Yeah, so to revise a flow like this, as far as okay, so yeah, that's actually a great question. I'm going to try to think about what I've done in here that has been kind of a refactor. So one of the kind of the later additions that I did to all of this was I attempted to implement batching for high volume runs. So, anticipating that, because there are loops involved, and so it's going to hit some flow limits when you have a run of this that exceeds a certain amount. So what I did here, which I actually have in place right now, I have a batch limit in place, which is to set, which is if it's going to be more than 100 records, it'll actually stop doing the loop. It'll temporarily exit the loop to go around and kind of start over again and wait. And actually, I have it in those instances waiting for not 24 hours to pass, but just a minute. So what the theory around all of this was when you separate the runs by a minute, it actually shows up as multiple runs. So you don't hit those per run limits that you would normally hit. I did hit a different limit, and that's actually a kind of a final word of warning slide that I have to share here. I think I'm getting a little bit away from describing kind of the refactor approach around all of this, though. So I think one of the things that goes into a refactor that is having that testing mechanism set up from the beginning is really helpful, because you can tell it to do log only, and it'll and as long as you have something in there that where you feel confident that decision will be respected. Like here, basically I've separated out all the changes to the database live right here. So I can feel fairly comfortable that I've kind of isolated all the database changes to a specific part of my flow, and so I can make sure that my decision about to do those updates or not do those updates is respected effectively, because it's a lot easier to see what's going to point there versus what won't. So in this case, really, there's only one thing that could possibly point to those updates, which is that I have a decision about whether to make the updates or not, and that's how I handled that.
Yeah, I mean, refactoring flow and process builder, it's always going to be difficult. There's not really, unless it's a very minor change, you're always going to run into some issues. And as Matthew said, you got to just test, and that's something I feel like a lot of times the non-coders, we like to kind of just assume it's working a little bit more and not thoroughly test like developers have to do with the Apex code. So yeah, that would be I guess my 2 cents to add in there. We got another question from Parker. Obviously you've made extensive use of wait elements. Have you ever ran into the error that has been dubbed the infinite loop error, an error you may receive after many iterations of the wait element loop?
I haven't hit that one, but that's actually a really good segue into the one that I have hit, which is this one. So this is just a word of warning, something that I have encountered, and the solution to it, as it so happens, is just to kind of restart it. But you can see I got this email on January 1st. I had a whole bunch of records in my database that were supposed to expire January 1st, and it gave me this interesting message that I have Googled a few times now, and there doesn't seem to be any documentation anywhere of what this means, but the interview is Lou Large to be saved. That's some Lou humor for your day. It seems to be hit in these situations where you do have things that wait and loop and wait and loop, and I was finding it happening on batches of about 200 or more records, and that's not like a huge limit, I will say. I mostly feel comfortable under that limit, and feel comfortable kind of when I do get an error like this going in and running my flow again so that it restarts, and if I need to play catch up, running it for whatever past dates would have been missed. But for now, this is kind of an issue that if the community happens to reach back out to me after this webinar and fill me in on what specifically this is referring to and what I could do to mitigate it, that would be great. But um, haven't seen anybody discuss it either on the Success community or anywhere out on the broader Googleable world for now. Okay.
All right, and then we've got one last question here. And it is, when you covered fast lookups, you mentioned being mindful to limit how many queries you were asking so as not to inhibit performance. Can you elaborate on this? Some rules of the road to this?
Okay. I'm just going to open up that questions pane so that I can, let's see.
And there's a lot of blog posts, while you're going to look that up, there's a lot of blog posts out there that kind of have a few kind of tidbits on that. I think probably one of the most recent ones that I read was Succeed with Salesforce. If y'all have been to that blog, there's one on kind of bulkifying some, I think it's called 5 Best Practices for Flow, and that's a good post that details it pretty well.
Yeah, one of the things that I have found around the queries is that you can get around it by, in a lot of cases, you can use features of, for instance, Process Builder to, you can have, if there's any way that you can update a batch of records all at once and have each of those records separately kind of do their own thing, that's one way to get around a lot of the limits inherent to the specific flow that you're running. In this one, I haven't really. This one actually is we're not really close to encountering the query limits for this one. Really, there's just a few queries going on, and it's nowhere near the limit of, I think, 200 that you can have in a given run of a flow. But you would want to, certainly you would want to avoid having a query come into play inside your loop. So there have been situations where I've needed to do queries inside of loops, and that's been a, kind of a, there are some situations where you kind of can't get around it, and in those cases you either have to live with the limitation or have somebody write code for you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for the great questions. Thank you, Matthew, again for the great presentation, and appreciate everyone spending your Friday afternoon with us.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks everyone for attending. Hope you all got something out of it, and hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
All right. Thanks everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks.